She came out of the blizzard with blood on her sleeve and a child pressed against her side, and she was knocking on the door of a man who didn't open his door for anyone. The little girl couldn't have been more than 6. She had no hat. Her coat was the wrong weight for a Montana winter. The kind of thing you grab in 3 seconds when you're not thinking about weather, you're thinking about getting out. The woman holding her had a gash above her left eyebrow that had been packed with what looked like a strip torn from a shirt. It had stopped bleeding, but not cleanly. Her eyes moved before her head did. She clocked the motion sensor light. She clocked the tree line. She clocked the fact that the porch light was on, but the windows were dark, and she made a decision in about half a second to knock anyway. Mason Whitaker had been watching her from the moment the sensor tripped. 2 feet. From his front door in the dark, through 2 inches of insulated storm glass, he had tracked her across the property with the same flat attention he used to give a ridgeline in places he no longer talked about. The blood. He saw the child. He saw the way she kept turning to look behind her, even while she was climbing his porch steps. Bracken was already at the door. Not barking, not scratching. Just standing there in the entryway, with his head low and his ears forward, staring at the door like he could see straight through it. That was the thing about Bracken, he didn't perform alarm. When something was wrong, actually wrong, he went quiet. Picked up the shotgun leaning against the wall. He didn't rack it, he just carried it to the door and stood beside the frame and said, "Who are you?" Not a question. A demand. "My name is Elena Ward." Her voice was steady in a way that felt deliberately managed. "I have a 7-year-old with me. Our van broke down on Route 9 about a mile and a half back. There are men on that road. I don't know how close they are a beat. I need 1 night, just 1 night somewhere warm. In the morning I'll figure out the rest." He didn't open the door. "How'd you find this place?" "I didn't. I just kept walking uphill because the road was flat and I needed cover. Was the only one I could see." He looked at Bracken. Hadn't moved. Still staring, still quiet. Mason opened the door. The woman stepped inside fast, pulling the child with her, and she immediately stepped to one side of the entryway out of the doorway's direct line and turned to look back the way she'd come. The behavior of someone who had just found shelter and was relieved. Behavior of someone who was still counting, said. And he closed the door and threw the deadbolt in the secondary chain, and he meant it, though he wasn't entirely sure yet. Who? He was saying it. The little girl's name was Nora. She had her mother's eyes wide set and dark, and she had stopped shivering by the time Elena peeled the wet coat off her, but her hands were cold enough that Elena held them between her own for a full 2 minutes without saying anything. Mason watched that. He watched the way Elena's hands were steady, even though her jaw was working like she was grinding something down. He put a blanket over the child. He put the kettle on. He said nothing. Back to Nora, sniffed her once, and lay down at her feet. Ina looked at the dog. Something in her face shifted, not relief exactly. Recognition. She had seen trained animals before. Tired. Mason said, "I can tell." She paused. Caution. "So are you?" He didn't answer that. He poured the hot water. He handed her a mug and watched her wrap both hands around it and drink without waiting for it to cool, which told him she was more depleted than she was letting on the road. He said, "How many? 2 that I saw. Possibly a third in a second vehicle." She drank again. They were driving slowly, searching the shoulders. "For you, for me." Why, she looked at him over the rim of the mug. Her gaze was direct and absolutely without apology. "That's a longer answer than tonight. Give me the short one." Something they want back, and they can't afford for me to hand it to anyone official. That's it. Outside, the wind pushed against the north wall of the cabin, with a sound like something trying to get inside. I had fallen asleep against the arm of the couch, one hand tucked under her chin, Bracken's warm bulk against her shins. That cut needs to be cleaned. Mason's, I know. I'll do it. There's a first aid kit in the bathroom cabinet, top shelf. I'll find it. She did find it. She was in the bathroom for 11 minutes. And when she came back, the cut above her eyebrow was closed with 2 butterfly strips applied at exactly the right angle, not too tight, not leaving any tension on the skin edges, and she'd washed her hands up to the wrists, a habit so ingrained it happened without thought. He noticed that too. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table. "You were military," she said, "not a question either." "Navy," he said, "special operations for a while." She nodded slowly. She looked at the table for a moment and then back at him. "The dog's not just a pet." "No, and the way you positioned yourself when I came in, you were covering the angle from the east window." "You'd already clocked the approach pads." He said nothing. "Okay," she said. "Then you understand why I can't give you more than that tonight." "Not." Because I don't trust you. Because the less you know, the less trouble I've brought to your door. He looked at her for a long moment. The storm was doing something violent to the trees east of the cabin. Windows had a faint gray shudder to them. You brought it anyway, he said. Trouble doesn't wait on information, she almost smiled. Not quite. No, it doesn't. She slept on the couch with Nora. He gave them both blankets and the spare pillow from the hall closet, and he went to bed with the shotgun within reach and Bracken at the foot of the door. He didn't sleep deeply. He didn't sleep deeply anymore. He hadn't since the Korangal, and that was 9 years ago, and some things just became the shape of your life. He was awake at 3:47 when Bracken's head came up, not a sound, not a bark. Just the dog lifting from sleep to full attention in the span of a breath, ears rotating like antennae toward the northwest corner of the property. Mason was out of bed and at the window in 12 seconds. He didn't turn on any lights. He looked into the dark and the storm and for a moment saw nothing. Then he saw the headlights. One vehicle stopped on the service road 100 yards north. It's off now, but the shape of it still visible in the ambient snow reflection. Sitting waiting. He pulled on his boots and his jacket, and he went to the living room doorway. Ina was already awake. She was sitting upright on the couch with Nora still asleep beside her, and she was looking at him with her hands flat on her knees, completely still, and her eyes had the kind of alertness that doesn't come from waking up. It comes from never really going under. Southwest, she said low, almost no voice at all. You heard it. No, I felt it. She glanced at Bracken. And then I watched him. Mason moved to the window beside the front door and angled himself to look without being silhouetted. The vehicle was still there. Another 2 minutes passed. Then it moved slow, no headlights, rolling north along the service road toward the county route. Ina let out a breath so controlled it was barely audible. They're doing a grid. They'll be back. How long do you have before they get coordinated? She thought about that in a way that wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. Sunrise, she said. Maybe a little after. Depends on how many they're running. And if they find the van, she was quiet for 3 seconds. Then they know I was in this area and they'll stop being careful. He looked at her in the dark. She looked back. In the wood stove had burned low and the room had the particular blue-gray quality of a Montana winter. At 4 in the morning, everything drained of color, everything stripped to its essential shapes. You should have kept walking, he said. My daughter's feet were bleeding, she said. Defensive. He didn't say anything to that. There was nothing to say. He put a log on the fire and added 2 more after it caught, because whatever was coming at sunrise, having a warm room wasn't going to make it worse. He made coffee, real coffee, not instant, and he put a mug in front of her without asking, and she drank it without thanking him. And somehow that was more natural than if she had. Operational situation. Resources and information and quiet. 5. Pifty told him about Redwood Valley Medical Center. Not everything. Just the edges of it. She'd been working there as a trauma nurse for almost 3 years. Record. No complaints. She'd noticed discrepancies in a supply manifest, wrong quantities, wrong vendors, costs that didn't line up with what was actually arriving in the trauma wing. At first, she thought it was a billing error. She documented it the way she documented everything, methodically, with timestamps, with copies. And a patient died, a 34-year-old man who came in after a construction accident. His injuries were serious, but survivable. The IV supplies used in his treatment were defective, the kind of defective that doesn't happen by accident. And when she pulled the intake records, she found the same vendor code she'd been tracking for weeks. She went to her supervisor. Her supervisor went quiet. 3 days later, she was called into the office of the hospital's chief operating officer, a man named Harlan Voss, and told that she had been observed accessing confidential financial records without authorization, that her employment was terminated effective immediately, and that any attempt to distribute those records would result in criminal and civil action. She was escorted from the building. Her key card was deactivated while she was still in the hallway. I'd already made copies, she said. I had been making copies for 6 weeks. I knew what was coming before it came. Where are they? She looked at him. Safe, he didn't push. He had the sense already that pushing this woman produced exactly as much as she decided to give, and not one word more. Voss, he said. You think he's the one who sent the men on the road? Voss has money. Voss has connections, and Voss has a great deal to lose if what I documented reaches anyone with subpoena authority. She paused. Yes, I think it's him or someone he's paying. How long have you been running 9 days? He absorbed that. 9 days. With a child in what was clearly not an adequate vehicle, in late November in the Northern Rockies. He looked at her hands again. They were chipped and slightly cracked at the knuckles, the skin around her nails rough in a way that happened from cold and wet and not enough time. She hadn't been staying in hotels, she'd been staying in the van. Where were you trying to get to, Billings? I have a contact there. I trust. She stopped had I stopped 2 days ago and sent a message asking them to meet me. They never replied. That was when I knew the net had gotten wider than I thought. He understood then how alone she was. It wasn't a realization she displayed. It was something he read in the geometry of how she held herself self-contained to the point of compression, like someone who had been their own entire support structure for long enough that they'd forgotten what it felt like not to be. At 6, Bracken stood up, not the slow reorientation from before. A full, immediate standing, weight forward, tail down eyes on the door. He made no sound. That was the worst part, dog who makes no sound. Because it knows sound is a liability. Mason was at the window. 3 seconds later, headlight. 2 sets coming from the east this time, which meant they'd circled around during the dark, which meant they had more vehicles than Elena had estimated. Nora, he said. Elena was already moving. She had the child up and against her shoulder, still asleep, mostly making a soft, confused sound before the words were fully out. She moved to the interior wall opposite the windows into the narrow hallway that led to the back bedroom, the way you'd move in a structure with incoming fire. Mason registered that he filed it. The vehicle stopped at the end of the long dirt drive. 2 men got out of the first truck. They were wearing county sheriff's department coats. That was the first thing. They were wearing the right clothes. The second thing Mason noticed was that neither of them touched their radios. County officers, at a remote call in a storm, would have checked in before approaching. They came up the drive side by side, not in file, and that was wrong too. He set the shotgun behind the door where it wasn't visible, and he opened the door before they knocked. Awning, he said. The taller, maybe 35, flat expression eyes that moved too fast, held up a badge wallet. Mason looked at it the right amount of time to make it seem like he read it. Mr. Whitaker, Elias County Sheriff's Department. We've had a report of a vehicle disabled on Route 9, possibly with occupants. Have you seen or spoken with anyone in the last several hours? Oh. Mason said, storm like this, I wouldn't expect anyone. You mind if we come inside just to warm up for a minute, make some calls? Bracken appeared at Mason's left knee. He was looking at the 2 men with that absolute stillness again, the kind that wasn't aggression. It was assessment. Shorter. One younger, a little less comfortable in the coat, looked at the dog and shifted his weight backward by about 3 inches. Ontario. Trained animals read that. I'd rather you didn't, Mason said pleasantly. Dog doesn't like strangers in the house, sir. This is a welfare check. And I'm telling you there's no welfare issue here. I've been alone all night. He paused. You 2 drive out from Elias in this. That's a long road in a storm. The tall one looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes that wasn't friendly. We had a report, then you followed up on it. Nobody here. Mason leaned against the doorframe in a way that was completely casual and also completely blocked the entrance. I'd get back on the road before this gets worse. County route east of here floods fast when the temperature drops. Silence that lasted about 4 seconds too long. The tall one said, if you happen to see a woman, dark hair, possibly with a child named Elena, I'll call it in. Mason said, you got a number? Another pause. The tall one didn't produce a card. Had cards. Dispatch. We'll have it, he said. Sure, Mason said. They went back to the trucks. They didn't leave immediately. Mason closed the door and stood in the entryway and listened to the engines idle for almost 2 minutes before the headlights swung back toward the county route. Ina emerged from the hallway. Nora was awake now, quietly confused, clinging to her mother's shoulder with both arms. They didn't show they wanted me to actually read, Mason said. Stoppage was a county logo, but the number sequence was off. S County uses 5 digits. That was 4. Elena closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. How many people know that? Not many. She opened her eyes. The calculation in them had shifted, recalibrated for something she hadn't fully considered. They're going to come back, she said with more. Probably. Then we need to move before that happens. You've got a broken van 1.5 miles south and nowhere to go. Fine. No, she looked at him with a directness that was starting to feel familiar. That's why I'm telling you instead of just leaving. He looked at her. He looked at the child, who had fallen back against her mother's shoulder, with her eyes drooping again, who had slept through the approach of the trucks and the conversation at the door because her small body was still defaulted to trusting that her mother had it handled. There's a second vehicle in my barn, he said, 4-wheel drive. I'll get through this. I can't ask you didn't ask. He moved toward the kitchen. I'm going to make eggs. After that, we're going to figure out where these files of yours actually are and what it takes to get them into the right hands. And then we'll talk about moving." She was quiet for a moment. He could feel her processing not the offer, but the shift it represented. The difference between running alone and running with backup. How long it had been since she'd had the second thing. "Thank you," she said. "Don't, not yet." He cracked 2 eggs into the pan. "Tell me about Harlan Voss, the real version." She came to the kitchen table and sat down, and she settled Nora across her lap and pulled the blanket back around her, and she began to talk. The real version of Harlan Voss was considerably worse than the one she'd given him at 5 in the morning. Voss hadn't just covered up a supply scheme, he'd been running it for 4 years. The defective supplies weren't a side effect of cost-cutting, they were the product. He'd built a parallel procurement operation that moved substandard materials through legitimate hospital channels with falsified inspection records, pocketing the difference between what the hospital paid for and what it actually received. The patient who died in the trauma wing was not the first. Ina had tracked 7 incidents she could directly connect to supply failures. There were probably more she hadn't found. "At the records that prove this," Mason said. "On an encrypted drive," she said. "And copies of those on 2 separate cloud accounts that only I can access. So they can't get to the data without getting to you." He pushed the eggs onto a plate and put it on the table and found a fork and set it beside it and stepped back. Nothing. She did. She gave most of it to Nora, who ate with the focused efficiency of a child who has been hungry before and doesn't take food for granted. Touched them and felt something old and heavy move in his chest. Not sentiment exactly, more like recognition. The specific weight of watching people who had learned not to count on things. He'd had a wife who was like that. She'd grown up in eastern Wyoming, rough winters, and a father who drank and disappeared, and she'd had that same quality, that careful, measured gratitude for the ordinary. A warmth for eggs. He pushed that away. That was old territory. Nothing helpful lived there. He went to the barn and started the truck. When he came back inside, Elena had washed the plate and the fork and left them on the drying rack. And she'd refolded the blankets on the couch with the kind of automatic neatness that came from years of tidying up quickly, because you were always about to move. Nofra was sitting on the floor with the Brecken, her small hand buried in the fur at the back of his neck, and the dog was tolerating it with the patient dignity of a working animal in retirement who had earned the right to sit still. Ina was at the table, with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, staring at nothing. "You need to know something," she said when she heard him come in. "He waited before I was a nurse before Redwood Valley." She looked up at him. "I'm telling you because you need to understand what you're involved in. And because I think you already have a guess." He had a guess. "He'd had it since about 4 a.m. I was a combat medic," she said. "Attached to a special operations unit for 3 tours. Last one was classified, and I'm not going to give you the details. But I'm telling you so you understand that whatever is coming, I'm not going to stand behind you while it happens." He looked at her for a long moment outside. The storm had eased slightly, not stopped, but eased the way Montanans sometimes breathed between efforts. "I didn't think you were," he said. She held his gaze. Good Bracken lifted his head from Nora's hands and turned toward the north window. Not standing, not full alert, just orienting ears forward, reading something on the edge of perception. Mason moved to the window and looked out down the drive, barely visible through the gray-white of the storm, a third vehicle. From the first 2. Not a truck, a dark SUV, sitting completely still on the county road facing the cabin. Not moving, not turning around, just watching. Elena came to stand beside him. 2. He heard her breath change, not fear. A kind of grim, precise recognition. "That one isn't county," she said. "No, that one is different." He looked at the vehicle. It was positioned at an angle that covered both the drive and the service road. National placement, patient. Not the behavior of hired muscle or local law enforcement that had been bought. That was surveillance posture. Someone who had done this before and wasn't in a hurry. That didn't get wider, Elena said, her voice very quiet. Deeper. Mason kept his eyes on the SUV. His hand had moved without conscious decision to the wall where the shotgun was now propped, fingertips just grazing the stock. "Then we go out the back." He said, "They'll have the back." "Probably." Nora said something soft behind them. She'd noticed the stillness the way children notice the things adults try not to show. Ina turned and went to her and crouched down, and Mason heard her say something in a very low voice, calm and practical. The kind of voice you use when what you're communicating is stay quiet, stay close. Trust me. Walked back at the SUV. The driver's door opened. A man got out. He was wearing civilian clothes, no badge visible, no uniform. He was looking directly at the cabin with the focused patience of someone who wasn't there for conversation. He took out a phone, made a call, put the phone away. 40 seconds later, Mason's satellite communicator on the kitchen shelf began to emit a short, flat signal, not an incoming call, for frequency sweep. Someone was scanning for communications equipment, to see if the cabin was connected to anything outside. Elena heard it. She looked up from Nora and across the room at the communicator with an expression that closed down and went very still. She had recognized what it was, too. She stood up slowly, keeping her hand on Nora's shoulder, and she looked at Mason with something in her eyes that he hadn't seen there before. Not fear, not calculation, something more honest than both. "I'm sorry," she said. "I tried not to bring this to you." "You didn't bring it. It followed you. That's different." He picked up the communicator and turned a overs in his hand, looking at the scan alert. Then he looked at the SUV through the window. Then he looked at Elena. "You said 2 cloud accounts," he said. "And the drive is on you right now." She held his gaze. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and produced a small weatherproof case. She set it on the table between them without opening it. Looked at it. "Okay," he said, "then here's what we're going to do." He moved to the shelf and picked up the communicator and switched the antenna array to a different mode, one that wouldn't respond to a passive sweep, and he set it back down, and he pulled out the secondary handset from the drawer below, not connected to any registered account, and he looked at the single contact stored in it. The name in the call sign, 6 letters. Who owed him nothing and had every reason to pick up anyway. He looked at Elena. "You said you trust no one official," he said. "Not after what happened." "What I'm about to do isn't official," he said. "Not exactly. But it's not nothing either." She looked at the handset, looked at him. Outside, the man by the SUV had been joined by a second figure, and they were moving not toward the cabin, not yet, but repositioning, making angle. Slow and deliberate, Bracken moved to stand between Nora and the north wall, and the fur along his spine was up in a single quiet ridge that said clearly and without ambiguity that whatever was about to happen had already begun. "Make the call," Elena said. He made the call 3 rings. And a voice that was awake, the way soldiers are awake. Not groggy, not startled, just immediately present, the way certain people stay even in the middle of the night. "Baker Reyes." Mason kept his voice level and low. "I've got a situation developing at my location. 2 vehicles outside, minimum 3 personnel. Posture. Not law enforcement." He paused. "I have civilians inside." A short silence. "How fast is it moving?" "It's patient right now. That won't last. I can make some calls." "What am I looking for?" Mason looked at Elena. She gave him a small nod, one of those nods that contains an entire decision. Mason said. "Harlan Voss Hospital called Redwood Valley Medical Center. I need to know who he's connected to and how high it goes." Their pause longer this time. "That's an unusual request for a quiet man in Montana." "Fine. Oh, give me 40 minutes." The line went dead. Elena had heard enough of it to understand the shape. She didn't ask who Reyes was. She accepted the information the way it accepts a report. Take what's useful, move on. She went to the back window and looked out, scanning the tree line with the particular focus of someone who has done this before, who knows what a person looks like when they're trying to blend into landscape and almost managing it. "There's one in the tree," she said, east side, about 60 meters. Cautionary. Mason moved to look. She was right, a shape that was slightly wrong for the tree trunks around it, a little too vertical, a little too still in the way. Only a person can be still when they're trying not to move. "They're setting a perimeter," he said. "Been setting it since before they drove past the first time." She turned from the window. "The trucks this morning were a probe. They wanted to see how we'd respond. Oh, they know the layout." He looked at her. "You've run this kind of operation." "I've been on the other side of one." She said it without inflection, like a fact about weather. Context. Same geometry. Nora was sitting on the floor of the back hallway, wrapped in the heavy blanket with Bracken pressed against her side. She had Mason's old field compass in her hands and was turning it slowly, watching the needle. She hadn't made a sound in 20 minutes. Mason had noticed that about her. She had the quality of a child who had learned that being quiet was a form of protection, and she'd turned it into something almost deliberate. Not scared quiet. Strategic quiet. She was her mother's daughter in ways that went deeper than the eyes. The 40 minutes passed like something with teeth in it. Called back at 72 Voss's a problem, was the first thing he said. "Tell me. He's got 2 county commissioners in Elias County in his back pocket. That's why your fake deputies had county coats." Contractors. He's also got a relationship with a private security contractor out of Bozeman called Mercer Tactical. They work hospital and pharmaceutical security, mostly legitimate, but they do private enforcement work, and they're not careful about who they take contracts from. A pause. Sir has 3 active field teams. One of them has been operating off-grid for 8 days. 8 days. Elena had been running for 9, the woman he's looking for, Mason said. What's the official story? Theft of proprietary medical records and potential violations of federal healthcare privacy law. There's a warrant, but its thin looks assembled fast. Like someone needed a legal framework and didn't have time to build a solid one. Unofficially. There's a thread here that goes past Voss. I found 2 shell companies tied to the procurement operation. She apparently documented. One of them has a registered agent who shows up in 3 federal contracting databases. Reyes stopped. Whitaker. This isn't just a hospital administrator padding his budget. This is someone with enough reach to get a federal contractor involved in a domestic enforcement action. Wilson looked at Elena across the room. She was watching his face, read the call. She was good at reading faces. He'd noticed that too. I need more time, Mason said. You don't have it. Reyes's voice shifted. The Mercer team lead filed a location update 40 minutes ago. A break-in report on the satellite frequency you were running last night. You ran some sweep, so the scan hadn't just been looking for equipment. It had been listening for his response to finding it. He'd given them a signal when he switched frequencies. A mistake. The kind that happened when you'd been out of operational tempo for a while, and your muscle memory was slightly off. I'm going to send you something, Reyes said. You'll know what to do with it. Communicator buzzed a data packet, small, compressed, softened, and found a contact card for a special agent named Darrow at the FBI's Helena field office. A 6-digit verification code and a single sentence. She is not alone in this. Ask her about Sergeant First Class Dominic Vard. Mason looked up. Ina was already looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Careful, the look of someone who knows his name just entered the room before they've heard it said out loud. Who is Dominic Vard, he said. She held very still for a moment. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat in front of her, and her jaw did that working thing again. The thing she did when she was compressing something. He was in my unit, she said. He died on the 3rd tour. I can't give you details on. Mason waited. Also, kept records, she said, parallel to mine, different scope. Was meticulous. He saw things in theater that connected back to stateside supply chain irregularities. Procurement fraud, the same kind of defective materials showing up in forward operating bases that later showed up in Redwood Valley's trauma wing. She stopped. Before he could do anything with what he had. I didn't know he'd left copies. I didn't know they existed until 6 weeks ago. What happened 6 weeks ago? Someone mailed me a drive. She looked at the table. Drives. No note, just the drive. She looked up. I recognized his documentation style, the way he organized the files. It was his. Mason was quiet for a moment. So the Voss operation at Redwood Valley isn't isolated, he said. She said. It's one piece of a procurement network that's been operating across both civilian hospital systems and military supply chains. Figured that out. I figured out the civilian end. Together she stopped. Together it's enough to take apart something much larger than Harlan Voss. Outside, nothing had moved. The SUV was still on the road. The shape in the tree line was still there. They were holding. Which meant they were waiting for something. Mason went to the kitchen shelf and found the old topographic map of this corner of Elias County, the one he'd used for hunting before he'd stopped hunting, and he spread it on the table. He traced the service road, the county route, the treeland boundary, the creek bed that ran northeast along the base of the ridge. Ina leaned over the map without being invited. She oriented herself in about 4 seconds, which was fast for someone who'd never been on this property before. If they move before we do. She said, pointing to the creek bed. They'll want to block this. Agreed. But if we move before they do. There's a mining road, he said, putting his finger on a faint double line 2/3 of the way up the ridge. It's not on civilian maps. Comes out 3 miles north, connects to a state forest service route. They won't know it's there. She looked at the ridge elevation. She looked at the distance. She looked at Nora in the hallway with bracken. How long to the truck barns? 40 feet from the back door. 30 seconds to get it started in this cold. Calculated. The man in the tree line has a sight line to the barn door. There's a woodpile that breaks the angle if you go left of the path. She straightened up. You've done this, practiced it, he said. In different reason. When you live alone out here, you think about your exits. There was something in the way she looked at him. Then that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite recognition. Something. And then the particular expression of someone who understands a specific kind of alone. But we should wait for one more thing, she said. What? I need to transmit the file list, not the files, just the index. Address. Dom set up before he died an automatic relay. She looked at the weatherproof case on the table. If something happens to us, the index is enough for someone who knows what they're looking at to start pulling threads. It won't bring them down on its own, but it means the trail doesn't die here. Auditor. That's your dead man switch. It's the only leverage we have. She was very direct about it. If they know the information survives us, there's less incentive to make sure we don't. What about that? It was sound. It was the logic of someone who had thought through this situation, past the emotional edge of it, who had gotten to the cold operational center and made decisions there. It was the logic of a combat medic who'd been trained to keep functioning after the point where most people stopped being able to. Dewey said. She opened the case and connected the drive to a small secondary device. She'd been carrying something that wasn't a commercial product, military adjacent, the kind of thing that didn't show up in any consumer supply chain. She transmitted in under 90 seconds. The device gave a single confirmation pulse, and she closed it back into the case. She said. Mason picked up the secondary handset and called the number Reyes had sent. Agent Darrow answered on the second ring, and Mason gave him the verification code, and the conversation that followed lasted 6 minutes and covered enough ground that by the end of it, Darrow had a partial case outline, a witness, and a location. And it wasn't enough for an immediate response, but it was enough to open a file, and an open file meant the silence around this situation had been broken. It wasn't over, but it was different. He said 48 hours, Mason told Elena when he hung up. 48 hours is a long time, longer for them than for us now. She looked at him steadily. You believe that? I think the moment I called Reyes, the calculus changed. Quiet. It's not quiet anymore. He folded the map. That doesn't mean they'll stop. It means they'll accelerate. Understood. He could see her understanding it in the way. Her posture shifted, not tenser exactly. Consolidated. Pulling inward, gathering what she had. Awa. She called down the hallway. Quiet, but clear. The girl appeared in the doorway with Bracken at her heels and the compass still in her hand. She looked at her mother with those wide, dark eyes that were too old for her face and said nothing because she knew how to read a room. We're going to take a walk to the truck, Elena said. It's going to be a little cold and we're going to go fast. You remember how we practiced in the parking lot? I nodded. Just once. Same thing, you hold my hand and you don't stop for any reason until I say stop. Elena crouched to look at her directly. I've got you. I always have you, okay? Okay, Nora said. It wasn't false. It wasn't performed. It was just the truth between them. The kind of thing that gets said between people who have relied on it. So many times it's become more than words. Eyes turned away from it because it wasn't his to look at. He put on his coat and checked the shotgun-loaded safety on and slung it over his shoulder at an angle that was casual, if you didn't know what you were looking at, and something else entirely if you did. He went to the back door and looked through the narrow gap at the edge of the frame, checking the angle from the tree line to the woodpile. The shape in the trees hadn't moved. The sky had lightened to the flat pewter gray of a storm mid-pause. Not enough visibility to help anyone, not enough cover to hurt. Left of the path, he said. Oh, move fast. Stop when I stop. I know how to move, Elena said. I know you do, he said without looking at her. He opened the door. Cold came in like a hand against the face. Nora made a small involuntary sound but didn't slow down. Ina put her against the wall and stepped out first, and that was something Mason absorbed immediately. The fact that she had positioned herself to go first, to be the one exposed, and she'd done it without ceremony and without making it a statement. They went left. The woodpile was 6 feet of stacked lodgepole pine, dense enough to block the sightline from the tree line, and they moved along it in a tight line, Mason leading Bracken behind Elena, Nora in the middle with Elena's hand locked around her wrist. The snow was 8 inches deep and muffled everything, which was good for sound and bad for speed, and the distance between the cabin wall and the barn felt longer than 40 feet when you were counting seconds. The barn door had no lock on the outside. It swung inward, and Mason caught it before it could make noise and held it while they came through, and he pulled it closed. And the sudden darkened warmth of the barn heat from the old diesel heater. The smell of oil and dry hay was so violently different from the outside that Nora made that small sound again. It's something closer to relief. Mason got the truck started. The engine turned over on the second attempt, which in this temperature was actually fine. and he let it idle for 30 seconds minimum to get oil pressure up, something you couldn't rush. And in those 30 seconds, Elena went to the barn's side wall, where there was a crack between the boards, wide enough to look through. "I haven't moved," she said yet. The word sat there. He put the truck in reverse and looked at Elena. She had Nora up on the seat beside her, and Bracken was in the back of the cab, already settled, calm in the particular way of a dog that trusts its handler and transfers that trust to whoever the handler trusts. "Mining road," he said. 2 miles on the service route, then right at the dead birch. Often's. The road's rough, it's not been graded in 3 years, and there's probably 2 feet of drift in the lower section. I'll manage. I know. He looked at her one more time. Often. Something about the moment required it, not sentiment, just acknowledgement. Right. 2 people who had come to the edge of a situation together and were about to find out what the next part looked like. Behind me. "If I brake hard, go right immediately into the trees if you have to." "Don't wait to see why I braked." She held his gaze. "To you." He pulled out of the barn. The service road was white and unmarked and completely silent, the storm having smoothed over everything that had happened on it in the last 12 hours. Right. He drove without headlights for the first quarter mile, using the ambient snowlight, keeping to the right edge where the tree cover was heaviest. Behind him in the side mirror, he could see Zena's lights also off, also right-edged. She'd figured it out without being told. They made the dead birch at the 3/4 mile mark and turned right, and the mining road was exactly as bad as he'd described. The truck shuddered across the first washed-out section and found purchase on the frozen gravel underneath, and he heard somewhere behind him the sound of Elena's vehicle making the same argument with the same ground and winning it barely. The ridge road climbed. The storm closed behind them like a curtain. He was 400 feet up, the cabin invisible below the county road, completely gone behind the ridge profile, when his secondary handset buzzed. Reyes. Not the number he didn't recognize. Fucker. Code 406 Montana local he almost didn't pick up. The timing was wrong. The source was wrong. And nothing about a call from an unknown number at 8:00 in the morning in the middle of an active situation was good. He picked up a man's voice, calm, almost pleasant. The kind of calm that isn't natural. It's applied like paint over something rough. It's Mr. Whitaker. "I think we should talk before this becomes something that affects people who don't need to be affected." Mason said nothing. "The woman you're helping made a serious mistake. She took property that wasn't hers, and she's been using it to coerce legitimate business interests. All we want is to resolve this quietly." A pause. "You seem like a reasonable man." "There's no reason for anyone to get hurt." Mason looked at the road ahead, at the ridge line, at the snow coming down, again light and steady, the next arm of the storm moving in. Mason said. A short pause. "I represent certain interests." "Yes." "And you've been tracking this call." "We're tracking everything, Mr. Whitaker. That's the point I'm trying to make." The voice lost a little of its pleasantness. "You called people this morning. We know which ones. And I want you to understand what that means for the kind of protection you think you've set up." I think you should talk to Agent Darrow," Mason said. "In the field office. You already have the number." He ended the call. He drove another 100 yards before he braked and got out and went back to Elena's window. She already had it down. She'd read the stop. "They tracked the federal call," he said. Her face did something complicated. "How they have reached into somewhere they shouldn't." "Yes," said a federal contractor. "That means resources." She was quiet for a second. "Darrow's compromised." "I don't know. Maybe just flagged. Maybe they have someone monitoring communications from that field office." He looked at her. The snow was falling on both of them, soft and indifferent. "Means our 48 hours just got shorter." How much shorter? He thought about the voice on the phone. The specific quality of its calm. The fact that it had come after the Darrow call and not before. "They're already repositioning," he said. "Whatever they had around the cabin, that's not the full picture. There's something else, something moving toward wherever they think we're going." Ina looked at the road ahead, at the ridge, at the white distance. That was all they had. "Then we need to change where we're going," she said. "Yes, do you have somewhere else?" He did. He had one more place. He hadn't been there in 4 years. He wasn't sure the road was still passable, wasn't sure the structure was still standing in any meaningful way. And he was certain that what waited at the end of it was the specific kind of pain he had spent the last 4 years specifically not going back to. But he knew the location like he knew his own hands, and no one else knew it existed. He looked at Elena. He looked at Nora in the seat behind her, turned sideways, watching him with those ancient young eyes. The compass still in her hands like a talisman. She didn't fully understand but wasn't willing to put down. He said, I have somewhere. He went back to his truck. Right. He sat for 1 second with his hands on the wheel and breathed through something that had no name he wanted to give it. Fine. Then he drove. They were a mile from the ridgeline, the mining road disappearing into dense lodgepole pine on both sides when Elena's headlights came on behind him. Navigational. She'd seen something. He looked in his mirror and followed her sight line, and there at the base of the ridge where the service road bent south was a set of headlights coming fast. The SUV. Something larger, multiple vehicles, moving in a way that wasn't cautious anymore. Phone buzzed on the seat, a text from Reyes, 2 words. Hi. They know. Mason pressed the accelerator down. The headlights at the base of the ridge were not following the mining road. They were cutting across the lower slope off-road, which meant they had a terrain map that wasn't public, and a vehicle heavy enough to move through 2 feet of Montana snow without getting buried. That wasn't Mercer hiring local muscle anymore. That was Mercer bringing the right equipment, which meant someone had made a decision to stop being patient. Often pushed the truck harder. The mining road crested at a narrow saddle between 2 ridges and dropped sharply on the north side, and the drop was the dangerous part, loose shale under the snowpack, no guardrail, a 40-foot fall on the right side that ended in frozen creek bed. He'd driven it twice in good weather and once in rain, and he did not love his odds in this, but the alternative was behind him and gaining. He heard Elena's truck make the saddle, heard the brief slide and recovery as her tires hit the same loose section. She didn't stop, she corrected, and kept coming. The north slope opened into a shallow valley still inside the tree line, and the old ranch road he was aiming for split off 300 yards east of where the mining road bottomed out. He found it by the broken fence post. He'd nailed a strip of orange surveying tape 2 years ago. The tape still there, bleached almost white, but visible if you knew what you were looking for. He turned. Elena followed without hesitation, which meant she'd either seen him point to it before they left, or she was reading his intent through the mirror and making decisions on fractions of information. Either way. The ranch road was bad. It had been a service track for a grazing operation that folded in the 90s, and no one had graded it since. The truck bottomed out twice in the first quarter mile, and the second time was hard enough that he heard something shift in the truck bed. Stop. You don't stop in the middle of a run because something shifts. The structure he was heading toward had been his wife's idea. Kyra had found the property 5 years into their marriage, when she was in remission and feeling like the world owed her something beautiful, and she'd been right. A converted hunting cabin on 60 acres of private land that bordered the national forest, far enough from everything that the only way you knew it was if someone who loved it told you. She'd wanted to make it a home. They'd spent 1 summer rebuilding the porch and replacing the roof and arguing about window placement in the way that people argue when they're actually happy. Then she got sick again and the project stopped, and after she died, he'd locked the cabin and left and not gone back. He was going back now at 40 miles an hour with a Mercer team in pursuit, which was not how he had imagined it. The cabin came into view through the tree line intact, smaller than his memory had stretched it, the porch he'd rebuilt still standing, the roof holding under a season's worth of snowpack. He pulled around the back and killed the engine and was out of the truck before it fully stopped, moving to Elena's vehicle as she braked hard in the snow. He said now she had Nora out and moving in 3 seconds. Jumped from the cab and landed and immediately went to the tree line and stood there reading it. Mason followed Elena and Nora through the back door. The lock was a deadbolt with a key he'd kept on his main ring for 4 years without ever taking it off, and it opened on the first try, which was something cold, dark, the specific stillness of a space that has been closed and waiting. The furniture, Kira had picked a worn green couch, a table with mismatched chairs, was still there under a film of dust. The wood stove in the corner was old cast iron and intact. Went for it immediately, found the dry wood stacked in the alcove beside it, found the matches on the same shelf where they'd always been, and had a fire going in 4 minutes. Not warm, not yet, but the stove was alive. Ina had already done a perimeter check of the interior, moving through each room quickly, checking windows, checking spots in. She came back to the main room and said, "One window on the east side doesn't latch fully. Everything else is solid eastern window. There's a sliding bolt on the upper frame," he said, behind the curtain. She went back without comment, and he heard the bolt slide. Nora sat on the green couch with Bracken and pulled her knees up and watched the stove beginning to work with the patient concentration of a child who has learned to find comfort in small, reliable things. The sound of the pursuit vehicles had faded. The ridge between the 2 properties meant they couldn't hear the lower slope anymore, and that was both good and bad. Good because it meant they were harder to track acoustically. Bad, because it meant they couldn't hear what was coming. Hines set the secondary handset on the table and looked at it. Reyes had sent 2 words. They know he hadn't sent anything since, which meant either Reyes was in the middle of something, or Reyes had gone dark deliberately. The kind of silence that was itself a message. Don't call out, don't create signal. How far back were they? Elena asked. Half-mile when I last saw them. Yes. And they don't know this property? It's not at my name, he said. It was in Kira's. And she never transferred it state probate, put it in a trust with no residential address attached. He paused. It would take someone with access to county deed records to find it, and then they'd need to know the road. How long does that kind of search take with the right access? An hour? 2. He looked at her. We've got some time, not a lot. She was already opening the weatherproof case. She set the drive on the table and connected it to the transmission device and looked at him. Arrow might be flagged, she said, but there's a second contact. DOM built into the relay. She looked at the device. I send the full package. Now, not just the index, the full documentation. It goes to a secure legal archive with automatic notification to 4 separate recipients. Department of Justice oversight. The Inspector General for Health and Human Services, a watchdog journalist, and a federal public defender, with standing in healthcare fraud cases. She looked up. Once it goes, it can't be recalled, and everyone on that list gets notified simultaneously. He understood what she was saying. Once sent, the operation against her lost its primary purpose. What they were protecting ceased to be protectable. The calculus shifted from stop her to damage control, which was a different and less lethal problem. Do it, he said. The transmission takes 11 minutes on this bandwidth. If they find us in that window. Do it, he said again. She started the transmission. 10 minutes and 10 seconds was a very specific amount of time to be in a cold cabin waiting for something to either finish or fall apart. Mason spent the first 4 minutes at the east window watching the tree line. He spent the next 3 making sure the wood stove had enough in it to run for 4 hours. He spent 2 more looking at the walls, the window measurements. Kira had argued about the sconce she'd found at an estate sale in Great Falls and painted matte black because nothing in a hardware store was ever exactly right. He spent the last 90 seconds looking at the device on the table and counting. 11 minutes and 6 seconds. The device pulsed. Elena looked at it. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, she looked steadier, not relieved. Steadier. The way a person looks when a thing they've been holding for weeks finally leaves their hands. She said. 3 minutes later, Ken started barking. The silent. Watching. Barking full voice once, then twice. Then a series of rapid alerts that Mason had heard in a different context on a different continent, and which meant a specific thing will contact. Multiple converging. He was at the window. Through the trees, he could see a shape moving on the north side. Not a vehicle, a person moving on foot through the snow, and behind them another, and these weren't moving cautiously. They were moving fast and low and fanned apart, which was a tactical approach pattern and not a welfare check. How many? Elena said she was already at the other window. 2 visible, probably more I can't see. They flanked the road. She was thinking out loud, processing. They didn't follow us. They had a second team that went around. He'd made an error. He'd been thinking about the vehicles on the slope and not about what a second team without vehicles could do. 2 years ago, he wouldn't have missed that. He'd been out too long. How do we play this? She said, not panic direct. They want you alive. He said, you have what they need. They won't open with lethal. They'll try to breach and grab us, which means they'll try to get through the doors fast, which means front window exploded inward. Not gunfire, a breaching charge, small shape designed to blow the window latch without fragmenting the frame. The window swung open and cold air and smoke hit the room simultaneously, and Nora screamed the first to sound, and Elena had her off the couch and behind the wood stove before the smoke cleared. The man who came through the window was big and fast and had his weapon up the moment his feet hit the floor. And Bracken hit him from the side at full extension, 70 pounds of retired military working dog who had not forgotten a single thing. His handlers had taught him, and the weapon discharged once into the ceiling, and the man went down hard. Mason was on him in 2 seconds. Short, controlled exchange that ended with the man face down on the floor and zip-tied at the wrists, with the ties Mason kept in his jacket pocket, a habit he'd never explained to anyone and never stopped maintaining. Down. But the breach had come from one direction, which meant there was pressure being built on the others. The back door took a boot. 3 impacts in fast sequence, the lock holding on the first 2 and failing on the third. The door swung open and a second man came in, low weapon raised. and his eyes went to the room and found Mason, and he did not find Elena, because Elena was no longer behind the wood stove. She hit him from his blind left side with the cast-iron poker from the fireplace set. Not swinging for the head, she swung for the weapon arm just above the elbow. The specific point where a solid impact the radial nerve and drops whatever a person is holding, and hit the floor. The man made a sound that was more shock than pain. The kind of sound that comes from a limb's suddenly not responding, and he tried to turn, and Elena drove her knee into his thigh, targeting the femoral not to injure balance, and he went sideways into the wall. He slid down it and sat on the floor, breathing hard and holding his right arm with his left, and his face had the expression of someone who had not been briefed on what they were walking into. Stood between him and Nora, a beat of silence that lasted about 3 seconds and felt like 30. Then the man on the floor looked up at Elena, with his arm still cradled against his body, and he said through a clenched jaw, "That's broken." "Not," she said, "it's a radial nerve strike." "The feeling will come back in about 10 minutes." She looked at the arm. Eyes changed, not softer, exactly, more precise. The way a person looks when they're doing something they actually know how to do. Let me see it. "Don't touch me." Your arm is hyperextending at the elbow, because your grip instinct is still suffering, but the nerve isn't responding, and you're going to do real damage if you keep holding it like that. She crouched in front of him. "Let me see it." He looked at her for a moment, with the specific hostility of a man who has been sent to take someone and is now being treated by them. He held out the arm. She examined it quickly and efficiently, running her fingers along the radial groove, checking sensation with a light pressure at 3 points, assessing whether the elbow joint had taken any structural impact. It hadn't. The nerve strike had been clean, which was not an accident. "Be fine," she said. "It'll hurt for a few hours." "Fine." The man looked at her. Something shifted in his face that wasn't gratitude and wasn't entirely hostility either. I think more confused than either. "Who are you?" he said. "Who they told you," she said. Mason had moved to the blown-out front window and was scanning the tree line. The assault had been 2 men fast, confident, expecting minimal resistance. That was the brief they'd been given, a nurse with a kid and an old soldier in a remote cabin. They'd sent 2 because 2 should have been enough. They hadn't sent 2 because 2 was the full team. "There's more outside," Mason said, holding Elena said. She was still crouching near the man on the floor, but she was looking at the window. "They're holding because the breach didn't produce. They're waiting for a signal that didn't come." She thought for a moment. "They'll regroup for maybe 5 minutes, long enough." But he picked up his handset, not the secondary, his primary. Directly, no text, no code. Reyes picked up on the first ring. "I need you to send what you have to the Montana Highway Patrol and the Elias County Sheriff directly," Mason said. "Not through Darrow. Direct to dispatch. I need patrol units moving toward my secondary property." He gave the coordinates in a format that Reyes understood and would know how to translate. "And I need it in the next 10 minutes or it won't matter." That's a hard ask from a civilian line, I know. The Darrow flag, it wasn't Darrow. It was a monitoring tap on incoming calls to the field office from unregistered numbers. Darrow's clean. "He's been trying to reach you." Mason looked at Elena. "Can you reach him now?" Mason said. "He's standing." Then both Darrow and the state patrol. Them. "There's an active assault in progress, 2 men in custody, unknown number of additional personnel on the perimeter." He paused. "And Darrow. She sent the full package 11 minutes ago. I'll know what that means." Reyes was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. He said, and hung up outside. The tree line was still. Still, the 4-minute window Elena had estimated was closing. She had moved away from the man on the floor and was standing near the wood stove, and she'd picked up the fallen weapon from the back door entry. She handled it with the automatic familiarity of someone who'd carried one, checking the chamber, confirming the safety, holding it in a low-ready position that was textbook and natural. Mason registered it and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. It was what it was, and she was what she was, and the moment for being surprised by that had passed about 6 hours ago. Nora was behind the wood stove. Bracken was with her. The girl had her knees drawn to her chest, and she was very still and very silent. And her eyes were tracking her mother with the focused attention of a child who has decided that her mother's position in space is the most important piece of information in any room. A man at Mason's feet. The one Bracken had taken down had regained enough presence to lift his head. Toppin was gone. His zip ties were tight, and he had a gash across his forehead from going down hard on the cabin floor that was bleeding steadily into his eyebrow. He looked at Elena with the same expression his partner had used. Calibrating. "You're going to tell me about the perimeter," Elena said to him. "I'm not telling you anything." There are state patrol units moving toward this location right now, she said. Lines. And in about she looked at Mason and he held up 4 fingers. 4 minutes, you're either one of the people who cooperated or you're not. That distinction is going to matter later. The man on the floor worked his jaw. He had the look of someone who was employed rather than devoted a contractor, not a true believer. Someone who took the job because it paid and hadn't fully thought through what the job actually was. Outside, he said. 1 north, 1 east. The team lead is in the vehicle on the county road. He won't approach until he gets a confirmation signal. It's the signal. The man hesitated. Church clicks on channel 7 of the comms unit in your chest pocket, Mason said, because he'd done an approach protocol search while the man was still face down and had already found the radio. The man on the floor looked at him. Then he just stopped resisting in the way that people stop when the math stops working. Anna went to the window, careful angles, not silhouetted, and she studied the tree line for a moment in silence. Then she looked at Mason with an expression he was beginning to read, the one that meant she had a line of thinking that was about to become a plan. I want to talk to the team lead, she said. Not because I think he'll listen, because I want him on record. She held up the transmission device. It says audio capture. I want him saying what this operation is and who authorized it. Even if he doesn't say it directly, I want his voice and his words in the same file as the documentation already sent. Mason looked at the device. He looked at her, thought about the voice on the phone that morning, the applied calm, the specific phrasing, the fact that it had known about the Darrow call. Someone's confident enough to reach out personally. Someone who thought the operation was still manageable. Want to negotiate. Mason said, good, let him. She took the device, and she took the weapon, and she went to the blown-out front window, and she stood to one side of the frame and called out into the white, cold morning with a voice that carried without strain. My name is Elena Ward. I'm a former Special Operations combat medic. I'm armed, and I have 2 of your people in custody. The full documentation package was transmitted 20 minutes ago to 4 independent recipients. I cannot recover it. A pause, deliberate and clean. But I will talk to whoever is making decisions out there. A minute. Then the state patrol arrives and that window closes. Silence from the trees. Then from the north tree line, a figure stepped out. He was wearing civilian technical gear, not the county coats the fake deputies had worn, not a contractor's tactical vest. A dark jacket, wool blend, good quality. He walked toward the cabin with his hands partially visible, not quite raised, not quite lowered. The posture of a man who is negotiating, but wants you to know he could stop. He stopped 20 feet from the window. He was older than Mason had expected from the voice 50s, careful eyes, the kind of face that had spent a long time in rooms where decisions had consequences and had learned to show very little. Mercer Field personnel. This was management. This was the man behind the contractors. He said, my name is Trenton Holst. I work for a risk management firm contracted by Redwood Valley Medical Center. For Voss, she said, a slight pause. I work for the organization's interests. His name. Another pause longer, Harlan Voss, Holst said. Us. The device in her hand was running, and this operation, these people, the vehicles, the 9 days of pursuit, across 3 states, Voss authorized this. Huck's jaw moved. He was smart enough to know what she was doing, and he was doing it anyway, because he still thought he had leverage. There are significant legal and financial interests at stake. Documents. That document fraud, she said. Deaths. A procurement network with federal contract exposure. She leaned slightly toward the window frame. Sergeant First Class. Dominic Vard's records are in that package, Mr. Ust. Everything he documented from the supply chain end. Everything I documented from the hospital end, and the connection between them that names the parent company above Redwood Valley. She watched his face. You already knew about Vard's records. That's why this started before I made a move. You were looking for them before I even knew I had them. Something went out of Holst's expression. It wasn't panic. It was the particular deflation of a man who realizes the room is much smaller than he thought. We can reach an arrangement, he said, but the certainty was gone from it. The arrangement was reached 23 minutes ago when I hit send. Her voice was flat and very calm. There's nothing left to negotiate. What you can do right now is call your personnel back and put your hands up and make this easier on yourself. Because the alternative is a conspiracy charge on top of everything else. And I don't think that's what you want. Ust stood in the snow for a moment. His eyes moved from Elena to the window frame to the visible interior of the cabin, and Mason could see him counting, doing the same calculation that the man on the floor had done, doing the math of how much was left to gain and what it would cost. A sound from the north, distant still far, but getting less far. Irons. the particular warble of Montana Highway Patrol on a county route, which in open terrain carried for a long way. 5. Holst turned his head toward the sound. When he turned back, something in him had resolved into a different shape. The negotiator was gone. What was left was a man running a different calculation entirely. Not how do I win this, but how do I limit this? I need to make a call, he said. Put your hands up first, Mason said from behind Elena. 5. Holst raised his hands slowly, and he stood there in the snow with his palms out, while the sirens got closer, and the two figures in the trees stepped out from the tree line with their hands raised without being told. 5. Because Holst had apparently given a signal of his own, not the radio click, something smaller, a gesture, and they were following his lead. Not out of breath. He'd been holding at partial depth for about 40 minutes. Right. He went to the back room where Nora was still folded behind the wood stove with Bracken. Right. He crouched in front of her. She looked at him with eyes that were dry and clear and working very hard to stay that way. It's okay now, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked past him toward the main room, where her mother's voice was still carrying, steady, precise, already giving a verbal account to the first patrol officer through the window, and something in Nora's face settled. I know, she said. My mom fixed it. He looked at the girl for a second. Then he not quite, but close enough. The first patrol units reached the cabin in 7 minutes. 3 vehicles, 6 officers behind them, arriving in a dark blue Federal SUV that was different in every visible way from the Mercer vehicles, a woman who showed her credentials to the lead patrol officer and then walked directly toward the cabin with the focused stride of someone who has been waiting a long time for a door to open. She stopped at the front window. She looked at Elena. Ward, I'm Special Agent Colette Ferris, FBI Financial Crimes. In office. She held up her credentials with both hands, so Elena had a clear view. I've been working a thread connected to Redwood Valley's procurement practices for 14 months. We received your transmission 51 minutes ago. She paused. Elena looked at Ferris for a moment. She looked at the credentials. She looked at the patrol units on the perimeter, and Holst standing with his hand still raised in the snow and the shape of the morning, finally shifted from something closing in to something opening up. She lowered the weapon. She set it on the windowsill. All right, she said. But Ferris was looking at the device in Elena's other hand. The transmission unit, and her expression had changed. Not surprised. Something more complicated. The 4 recipients, Ferris said carefully. One of them. The public defender contact. That flag came through our system about 40 minutes ago. She paused. The name on that account is Dominic Vard. Elena went very still. Vard is dead, she said. The account is active, Ferris said. And 40 minutes ago, it sent a reply. She held up her own phone, showing Elena the screen. Ward. There's something in Dom Vardy's documentation that we haven't seen before. Last night. Something that wasn't in the index you sent last night. She looked at Elena steadily. Athens. Something that names a second organization above the parent company. Above everything you found. Elena took the phone. She read what was on the screen. The color left her face in a way that wasn't fear. It was the specific pallor of someone who has just understood that the thing they've been running from is considerably larger than the shape it showed them. She looked up at Ferris. How long have you known about this second organization? She said. Ferris was quiet for exactly 1 second too long. Ferris didn't answer the question immediately, which was itself an answer. She stood at the window with her credentials still in her hand and her face doing the careful work of someone who is deciding in real time how much honesty the situation can hold. Elena watched her do it. She had watched people make that calculation before in command tents, in debriefs, in the hallways of hospitals, where administrator decided what a nurse needed to know and what she didn't, and she had learned to read the specific quality of the pause that preceded a partial truth. Ferris finally. Elena's jaw tightened. 6 weeks, we had a thread, not a case, a thread. At a shell company. Registration that showed up in 2 separate financial crimes investigations with no apparent connection. We were still building the link when your transmission came in. Ferris held her gaze without flinching. I am not going to tell you we had everything and sat on it. Fine. We didn't, but 6 weeks ago we knew there was a second layer, and we didn't know what was in it. Mom knew. Lena said he knew 6 weeks before he died. Yes, Ferris said. We think so. The patrol officers had Holst in handcuffs at this point, and the 2 men from the tree line were seated in the snow with their hands zip-tied behind them. And the first EMT unit had arrived for the man with the nerve-struck arm, and the one Bracken had put on the floor. Elena had given the EMTs a verbal handoff on both patients. The radial nerve impact, the scalp laceration, current vitals as she'd assessed them, and the lead EMT had looked at her and said, "You a doctor?" And she'd said no, and he'd looked at her again and accepted that and moved on because there wasn't time for a longer explanation. Mason was outside now, talking to the lead patrol sergeant in the precise, unhurried way he had of communicating information, not performing calm, just operating at the frequency that made people listen. Elena could see him through the window. The sergeant was taking notes and nodding and not interrupting, which was the correct response to Mason Whitaker giving a situation report. She looked back at Ferris, the second organization, she said. What is it? We're calling it Soulbridge in the working file. It's a holding structure, multiple shell layers registered across 4 jurisdictions. It owns partial interest in 14 hospital systems, including Redwood Valley. Also has federal contracting relationships through a logistics subsidiary that we believe supplied both the defective civilian medical materials and the parallel defective equipment documented in the military supply chain records. Ferris paused. What is files? Name a person, a specific individual at the top of the structure. 5. Someone with enough federal access to have procurement decisions routed through their office without triggering standard oversight. Elena was quiet for a moment. Voss knew about this person, she said. It wasn't a question. Voss worked for this person, Ferris said. Redwood Valley was one node in a much larger operation. Voss's fraud was essentially a franchise. He ran his piece and kicked revenue up the chain and kept his mouth shut. She looked at the device in Elena's hand. 5. Until you started pulling threads on his piece, and then the person above him decided that the thread needed to be cut. That was why the response had been disproportionate. That was why Mercer Tactical's best team had spent 9 days in a Montana winter instead of a process server and a legal threat. It wasn't Voss protecting himself. It was someone above Voss protecting the entire structure from one corner that had started to unravel. Elena closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Athens. She was running it backward, every decision she'd made, every piece she'd documented, every day of 9 days in a van with Nora, in the cold and understanding, now that the target on her back had always been larger than Harlan Voss's panic. She had been touching something that went far deeper and hadn't known it. Dom had known. Dom had seen it from the supply chain and understood what it connected to, and he had built the relay and the dead man protocols and mailed her the drive because he'd known that alone. He didn't have enough from one angle. Together, hospital end and military supply end. Together, it was the shape of the whole thing. 5. He'd been dead for 8 months. He'd been planning this for longer than that. She opened her eyes. The name, she said. The individual at the top of the Soulbridge structure. Is it in Dom's files? It's in a file that was encrypted separately from the rest. 5. We received it in the transmission, but we can't open it without a key. Ferris looked at her steadily. Password. Did Vard give you a key? Elena thought about the drive. The weatherproof case. The moment 9 days ago when she'd opened it for the first time at a rest stop outside Missoula with Nora asleep in the back of the van, reading Dom's documentation in the light of her phone, understanding what she was holding. There had been a second file, small, labeled with a string of numbers she'd assumed was a document ID. She hadn't opened it, she hadn't been able to, it was encrypted, and she hadn't tried to force it because she hadn't had the tools and because she'd had other things to manage like staying alive. But Dom had known she'd be the one opening it, and Dom had known her well enough to know what key she would try first. She looked at Ferris. Give me 10 minutes. She took the case and the device to the back room, where Nora was finally off the floor and sitting on the edge of an old cot with Bracken's head in her lap. The dog looked up at Elena and then put his head back down, which was a form of trust she found unexpectedly steadying. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall, and the drive connected to the device and the encrypted file open on the small screen. The key field was empty. She sat with it for a moment. She and Dom had served together for 2 years. They'd had the kind of friendship that military service builds fast and builds specific, forged in the particular pressure of places where you couldn't afford to be anyone other than yourself. Because pretending cost too much energy and energy was always short. They'd had a shorthand, they'd had references. They'd had a running argument about whether the best emergency field dressing was the Israeli bandage or the off-TT tourniquet that had extended across 3 continents and was never resolved. Glessoft wrong key. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she thought about the last time she'd seen him. Handoff at a forward operating base in a country whose name she still didn't say out loud in casual conversation. He'd been shipping out before her. He'd shaken her hand, not hugged her, because Dom didn't do that. He was specific about physical contact in the way of some people, and she'd always respected it, and he'd looked at her with those careful, watchful eyes, and he'd said, Ward, don't forget which end of the needle goes in. It was what he always said. Version of stay safe. The first thing he'd ever said to her first week of their first deployment, when she'd been 3 months out of advanced medic training and very confident and slightly wrong about the needle angle on a field IV. She typed Wichanathened Legis in the file opened. Right. She sat there for a moment looking at what was inside it. It wasn't a document. It was a folder, financial records, communications, a scanned copy of a contract with a signature block at the bottom, and a photograph. The photograph was a man she didn't recognize, in what appeared to be a government building, shaking hands with someone whose face was partially cut from the frame. The photograph, in Dom's meticulous documentation style, was a full name, a title, a federal agency designation, and a set of transaction records going back 11 years. The man's name was Raymond Eccles, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Procurement and Logistics at the Department of Health and Human Services, a federal official, sitting at the intersection of hospital procurement oversight and military medical supply authorization, with enough institutional position to route defective materials through legitimate channels in both systems simultaneously, and enough access to suppress any investigation that got close. Ina stared at the name for a long time. Then she picked up the transmission device and walked back to the front room and handed it to Ferris without a word, with the file open on the screen. Offers looked at it. The agent's face went several expressions in about 4 seconds, none of which she fully let through. She looked up at Elena. How did you open it? He trusted me to figure it out. Ferris looked at the file again. She looked at the name. She took out her own phone and made a call and turned slightly away, and Elena heard the words Federal Hold and Immediate Flag, and Do Not Notify HHS directly before Ferris moved far enough away that the conversation became indistinct. Tyson had come back inside. He stood in the doorway between the back hallway and the main room, reading the situation. He looked at Elena's face and then at Ferris on the phone and then back at Elena. Bad, he said. It goes to Washington, she said. He was quiet for a moment. How far up enough that the wrong people knowing about it before the right people move on it could kill the case. He absorbed that Ferris, she's calling it in right now. I don't know who she trusts inside the system. I don't know if she knows. Elena looked at him. She was very tired, not in a way that showed in her posture. She was holding herself with the same controlled steadiness she'd held all day, but in her eyes, in the specific quality of her stillness. I've been carrying this for 9 days, and Dom carried it for longer than that. And now it's in someone else's hands, and I don't know what that means. It means you did the part that was yours to do, he said. Looked at him. She wanted to accept that and couldn't quite, not yet. It means I hope I read Ferris right. He glanced toward the FBI agent, who was still on the phone, her back to the room. She drove out here alone, he said. No second car, no backup visible. That's not procedure, I know. That means either she's reckless or she came alone. So no one inside her office knew she was moving. Ina considered that the difference between those two things was enormous. Ferris ended her call. She came back across the room and looked at both of them with the kind of directness that had stopped performing anything. Raymond Eccles was placed on administrative hold 12 minutes ago, she said. I called. The deputy director directly personal cell. We've worked together before and I trust him in the way you can trust anyone in this business, which is carefully and with documentation. A pause. Eccles doesn't know yet. He's in a meeting in Washington that will run another 40 minutes. At the time it ends, there will be agents at his office. Voss. Elena said Voss is in Redwood Valley. He was in his office as of 45 minutes ago. We had eyes on him from the fraud thread. Ferris looked at her phone. Warrant is being drafted. It'll be executed within the hour. Elena looked at her. I need to be there, she said. Hawkins. Ferris blinked. Ms. Ward, not for the arrest. I don't need to watch them put cuffs on him. She was precise about it, not emotional. Records. There are patient files, medical records that were falsified as part of the scheme. Those records need to be flagged before the hospital goes into lockdown, because there are people currently receiving care at Redwood Valley whose treatment plans are based on fraudulent intake documentation. If no one who understands the medical side reviews those files before the facility is sealed, patients get hurt. She held Ferris's gaze. That's not vendetta, that's triage. Ferris looked at her for a long moment. The FBI agent was reassessing something, not Elena's credibility, something more specific than that. The specific nature of what Elena Ward actually was and what she was actually good at. You consult with the medical team on site, Ferris said. They can authorize that. But you don't go into the facility without an escort, and you don't touch any evidence files directly. Understood. And I need a full deposition before you go anywhere. Hours minimum. Then we'd better start. The deposition happened at the kitchen table of Harlan Whitaker's cabin with a patrol officer stationed outside, and an Fizz laptop open on the scarred wood surface and Bracken sleeping next to Nora on the old green couch. It was not a formal deposition in any physical sense. It was two women at a table with a recording running and one of them talking for 2 hours and 20 minutes with the kind of specific dated, referenced precision that made Ferris stop 3 times to verify documentation references and find them exactly where Elena said they were. Elena talked about the supply manifests. She talked about the patient who died. She talked about the vendor codes and the falsified inspection records, and the specific mechanism by which Voss's operation had moved substandard materials through legitimate procurement channels. She talked about Dom Vard and what he'd found on the military side and how the 2 threads connected through the Solbridge structure. She talked about being fired. She talked about the 9 days. She talked about it without self-pity and without dramatizing and without skipping any of the parts where she'd questionable decisions, the moment she'd kept driving instead of going to law enforcement, the calculation to go dark rather than reach out the choice to send Nora's daycare teacher. A text that said, "We're fine. Don't worry," instead of something that might have actually mobilized help earlier. She wasn't trying to look good. She was trying to be accurate. That distinction produced a quality of testimony that was rare enough that Ferris, who had been doing this for 16 years, stopped at the end and said, "Testified before dietary inquiry," Elena said after the 3rd tour. Standard. "After a classified operation, were you represented?" No, Ferris nodded slowly. "You should have been." "Probably." Mason brought coffee at the 90-minute mark, bad coffee, because the cabin supplies were 4 years old, and he'd had to guess at the proportions, and Elena drank half of it without commenting on the quality, which he appreciated. While Elena was still with Ferris, Mason stepped outside and called Reyes one more time. "It's resolving," he said. "I heard Eccles. That's a significant name to have in a case file." That hold. Reyes was quiet for a moment. "Depends on how fast they move and whether anyone inside HHS gets wind before the agents are in position. These things can go sideways in the last hour." Pause. "The document package is already with the IG and the watchdog journalist. Even if someone tries to slow the federal end, those 2 don't need anyone's permission to move." Mason looked at the tree line, clear now. The Mercer personnel were in patrol custody, the vehicles were being processed, and the morning had the particular quality of aftermath, that strange stillness after pressure lifts. The landscape looks the same as it did before, but everything in it has changed. "Yes," he said. "Thank you, you'd have done the same." "I don't know that I do," Reyes said and hung up. The arrests happened with the messy, imperfect, slightly delayed choreography of real law enforcement rather than anything cinematic. Harlan Voss was taken into custody at Redwood Valley Medical Center at 2:17 in the afternoon, which was 40 minutes later than Ferris had estimated, because the warrant had required an additional signatory who was not immediately reachable, and there had been a 20-minute gap that produced a specific kind of institutional anxiety in everyone who knew about it. He was walked out through the administrative entrance rather than the main lobby, because someone made a judgment call about optics, which meant the hospital staff didn't see it happen in real time. But the news reached the floor nurses within 6 minutes anyway, as news always does in hospitals, because nurses talk to each other and the network is faster than any official announcement. Holst was charged at the county level, pending federal coordination assault, conspiracy, an unlawful private enforcement operation, and the 2 Mercer Field personnel who'd come through the cabin windows were charged alongside him. The 2 men from the tree line were cooperating by the time the patrol units reached the booking facility, which was not surprising, and would eventually make their situation somewhat less terrible than Holst's. Eccles was placed under federal arrest at 3:44 p.m. Washington time in the corridor outside the conference room where his meeting had finally ended. Ina learned about it from Ferris via a text message while she was in the passenger seat of a federal vehicle heading southeast toward Redwood Valley. She read the message and looked out the window at the Montana landscape, moving past, and didn't say anything for a while. Mason was driving behind them in his own truck, which he'd insisted on rather than leaving it at the cabin. Anna was in the back seat of the federal vehicle with Bracken, who had been there for approximately 3 minutes before Ferris had looked at the dog, and then at Elena, and made a decision that the regulations governing animals in federal vehicles were perhaps flexible, given the circumstances. At Redwood Valley Medical Center was met by the hospital's acting administrator, a woman named Dr. Esoth, who had been the head of surgical services and had been handed the acting role an hour ago, when Voss was walked out, and by the hospital's patient safety officer, who looked like he hadn't slept in a while and had the expression of someone who had been waiting for something like this for a long time and didn't know how to feel about it, finally arriving. Elena spent 4 hours in a conference room with Dr. Scott's team and 2 FBI forensic accountants and a public health official that Ferris had pulled in from the state level, going through the flagged medical records with the methodical, unglamorous attention of someone doing genuinely necessary work. She found 11 patients whose current treatment protocols contained documentation inconsistencies that could be traced to the fraudulent supply records. 2 of those 11 were in acute care. She flagged them first. She wrote the clinical summary in clear, specific language that the treating physicians could act on immediately with the relevant documentation inconsistencies cited, without requiring them to understand the full scope of what had happened before they could do their jobs. She was not thanked while she was doing it. She was given access, information, a space, which was better. Mason waited in the hallway for most of it. At one point, a floor nurse recognized him as the person who'd come in with Elena Ward and said, "Is she the one who found all this?" And he said, "She found it a while ago. Today, she's just explaining it to people who are finally listening." The nurse looked at him for a moment and then went back to work. At 6 in the evening, Dr. Saith came out of the conference room and found Elena at the coffee machine in the hallway, standing very still with a cup in both hands and her eyes somewhere in the middle distance. The surgeon was a compact, precise woman who held herself with the specific confidence of someone who had operated in difficult conditions and knew exactly what she was capable of. "The 2 patients in acute care," she said, "we're adjusting their protocols now based on your flags." "Good," Elena said. "How did you know to look at the potassium supplementation records specifically?" The defective E compound batch that Voss sourced through the fraudulent vendor had documented electrolyte instability in the 3 inspection reports that were supposed to be suppressed. Patients with cardiac history receiving that batch needed their supplementation recalculated. "It's in the records if you know what you're looking for." She paused. I've been looking at those records for a long time." Studied her the nursing license termination. "We've been notified that the action is under review." "No, it should be reinstated within the week." "The paperwork was fraudulent. Voss had your supervisor file a complaint that was fabricated." "We have the internal communications now set." Paused. "For what it's worth, your personnel file before the termination was you were the kind of nurse this hospital should have kept." Elena looked at her. "You can save that for the formal review." "I know. I'm saying it now anyway." Saith held her gaze for a moment. "Thank you. For not letting stop at getting yourself cleared. For making sure the patients were the first thing." Elena didn't answer that, not because she didn't have words for it, but because the thing Saith was pointing at was so basic to how she operated that it didn't require acknowledgement. The patients were the first thing. That wasn't virtue. That was what the job meant. She drank the rest of her coffee. She was walking back toward the conference room when her phone buzzed with a number she recognized the automatic relay account Dom had set up. It was not supposed to generate outgoing communications after the initial transmission notification. The relay was designed to receive and forward, not to initiate contact. She stopped in the hallway. She opened the message. It was 4 lines of text formatted in Dom's documentation style, date-stamped, reference clean, additional encrypted file attached, unlock key, same as before. This one was not for the authorities, it was for you. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, D. She stood in the hospital hallway with the phone in her hand and the noise of the floor around her monitors, voices, the distant sound of a PA system. And she felt the message land in the specific way that things land when someone who is gone reaches back across time and touches something real. She opened the attached file, the key field open. She typed Wichenafthene Legis in the file opened. It was not financial records. It was not documentation of the fraud. It was a letter handwritten. Scanned Dom's handwriting, which she recognized immediately, the small, extremely neat block letters of a man who had done a lot of field documentation and had trained himself into clarity. She read it standing in the hallway, and by the 3rd paragraph her face had done something she hadn't planned for it to do. And she turned toward the wall and stood there for a moment, because the hallway was not the right place for this, but there was no other place available. The letter was about the classified mission, the 3rd tour, the one she couldn't give details on, the one where people died, and the investigation afterward had been sealed, and she'd spent 8 months carrying a version of events that she'd been told was the official record, and that had never once felt like the actual truth of what had happened. Had written down what he knew, the actual sequence. The decisions that had been made at the command level that had put the unit in that position, and the report that had been filed afterward that had not matched those decisions, and the name of the officer who had filed the false report, the same officer she now understood, who had been Eccles's military liaison. The thread from the supply chain fraud into the classified operation wasn't just financial. It was a cover-up of something that had happened to people she had served with, people who had not come home. And the man who had orchestrated the cover-up had been sitting in a federal office for 11 years, collecting a government salary and attending meetings. She stood with her back to the hallway wall and breathed. And then she straightened up, and she opened a new message to Ferris. And she typed, "There is a fifth file. I'm sending it to you now. You're going to want to read it before you close the Eccles case." She attached the file, and Senator hands were not shaking. She'd had years of practice at making sure her hands didn't shake when she needed them to do something. She was walking back toward the conference room when her phone buzzed again. Ferris. A number she didn't recognize, Montana area code, different from the one that morning. And she answered. A man's voice older than Holst, quieter than the Mercer team lead. Angry, not threatening, almost reflective. He said. "I think you know why I'm calling." She stopped walking. "Eccles," she said, someone acting on behalf of certain interests. A pause. "We've been watching this situation develop today with considerable concern." Eccles. That was not something we authorized. That exposure was Eccles acting beyond the scope of what he was sanctioned to do. She understood immediately above Eccles. Someone above Eccles who was now calculating what the arrest meant for the layer above him, and deciding that Eccles, like Voss before him, was a franchise that had become a liability. "You're disavowing him," she said. "We're clarifying the limits of our relationship with certain operations," the voice said carefully. "And we're reaching out, because there are elements of what's currently in federal hands that, if they become public in an unmanaged way, could affect a great number of people who have nothing to do with what Eccles was doing." "How many layers are there?" she said, a pause that lasted long enough to beat its own kind of answer. "Miss Ward, you've done something remarkable today. We have no interest in reversing that, what we're asking. No." She said the word was flat and complete and did not invite elaboration. She stood in the hospital hallway with the phone against her ear and let the silence run. "Whatever you were about to ask," she said. "No, everything that's in federal hands stays in federal hands. If there are layers above Eccles, that's for the investigators to find. I've done my part." She paused. "And if you call this number again, the recording of this call, which has been running since I answered, goes to Ferris." She ended the call. She stood there for a moment looking at the phone. She had been bluffing about the recording. Her phone did not have an active call recording function. Whoever had just called did not know that, and the call had not come back. She put the phone in her pocket and went back to the conference room and sat down at the table and picked up where she'd left off, reviewing the flagged records with the patient safety officer and an FBI forensic accountant who had the carefully rumpled quality of someone who had been doing painstaking work for a long time and had made peace with the pace of it. Outside the conference room windows, the Montana evening was coming down fast the sky, going from pewter to a deep cold blue. Mason was still in the hallway. She could see him through the glass panel in the door, sitting against the wall, with his jacket stout, with his long legs jacket still on and his eyes closed, but not in a way that suggested he was sleeping. In a way that suggested he was doing the same thing he'd been doing, since she'd knocked on his door waiting. Present Bracken was at his feet. Nora was asleep against Mason's shoulder, with his jacket pulled over her like a blanket. Her small face slack and peaceful in a way it hadn't been in 9 days, one hand tucked under her chin. Ina looked at them through the glass for a moment. Then the forensic accountant said her name, pointing to a record, and she turned back to the table. There was still work to do. The work ran until 9:47 that evening. When Elena finally came out of the conference room, the hospital's night shift had come on and the administrative wing had gone quiet in the particular way of institutional buildings. After hours, lights still on everywhere, the work still continuous, but the quality of the silence different, more interior. The forensic accountant had packed his laptop and gone to find a hotel. The patient safety officer had stayed through it all and looked like he'd aged 3 years in one day, which was probably accurate. Dr. Saith had stopped by once more at 8 o'clock to say that both acute care patients had been stabilized under the adjusted protocols and that the flagged records had been forwarded to every relevant treating physician in the facility, and that the hospital's board was convening an emergency session in the morning. Ina had said good and meant it without elaboration, because elaboration wasn't what the moment needed. Now, she stood in the hallway with her coat over her arm and her eyes dry and her whole body carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who has held a very high level of function for a very long time and is only now allowing themselves to understand what that cost. Not collapsing, not dramatic. Just the quiet internal acknowledgement that this had been hard, and it was in some essential way not over but different now. The thing that had been chasing her was behind her. The direction of the pressure had reversed. That was enough to feel for tonight. Mason was still in the hallway. He had moved at some point. Nora was now stretched to the waiting chairs with his jacket still over her. Her sneakers off and lined up neatly beside the chair legs in a way Elena recognized as her own habit reflected back. Something Nora had absorbed without being taught. Bracken was on the floor beside her. Lessons. Mason was standing near the window at the end of the hallway with a coffee cup in his hand and the same posture he'd had since morning, not tense, not restless. Just present in the way of someone who had decided to be somewhere and meant it. He looked up when he heard her footsteps done, he said. Not tonight. He looked at her for a moment. She was aware of how she must appear wrung out, still upright, the cut above her eyebrow still closed under the butterfly strips. She'd applied herself 18 hours ago in a stranger's bathroom. She didn't try to look different than she was. Nora ate something, he said. One of the nurses brought crackers and cheese about an hour ago. She ate about half of it and fell asleep mid-cracker. Ina looked at her daughter across the hallway, the small face, the neat shoes. The hand still curved around nothing because she'd been holding the compass when she fell asleep and it had dropped somewhere in the chair cushions. Thank you, Elena said. It came out rougher than she intended. She cleared her throat. For all of it, Mason looked at the window. Montana night was fully dark now, the parking lot lights creating small islands of orange in the cold. You don't have to do that, I know. She paused. I'm doing it anyway. He accepted that with a small nod and didn't make it into anything larger, which was exactly right. They drove back to Elias County in convoy, the federal vehicle ahead, Mason's truck behind. Nora transferred to the truck's back seat, still mostly asleep. Bracken resettled at her feet with the practiced patience of an animal that had learned to sleep in moving vehicles across a career. Ferris had arranged for a temporary housing situation in Elias, a motel that the county used for witness situations, quiet, clean, with a door that locked from the inside and a parking lot that a patrol unit would check twice in the night. Not ideal. Enough Elena had not yet asked what happened next in the logistical sense, because the answer to that question required a morning and not the tail end of the longest day she'd had in years. She'd learned that specific discipline in the field, the ability to partition. That needs to be managed now. What can wait until you've slept? Most things can wait until you've slept. She hadn't slept properly in 9 days, and she was going to sleep tonight, and in the morning the next part would still be there, manageable with a clearer head. What she did know, from the fragments Ferris had communicated across the day, was the shape of what was coming. Harlan Voss had been processed and was in federal custody pending arraignment. Charges were substantial. Healthcare fraud, wire fraud, obstruction, falsification of federal medical records, and a conspiracy charge that referenced the Soulbridge structure and named Enkles as a co-conspirator. Voss had requested counsel and had not spoken since the car ride from the hospital, which was the smartest thing he'd done in 4 years and came about 14 months too late. Raymond Eccles had retained a lawyer within 40 minutes of his arrest and was already, by all accounts, attempting to construct a cooperation framework, which was the behavior of someone who understood that the layer above him was real, and that being the person who named it was considerably better than being the person who took the full weight of it alone. Ferris had said, with the specific careful tone of a federal agent who does not make promises about ongoing investigations, that Eccles' cooperation, if genuine, would be evaluated on its own terms. Ina had understood that to mean he might get something for it, but not enough, and the something would cost him more of himself than he was currently prepared for. The voice on the phone, the one above Eccles, the one that had called to suggest a managed resolution, had not called back. Ferris knew about the call. The recording that Elena had bluffed about did not exist, but the conversation did, and Elena's account of it, time-stamped and specific, was part of the record. Ferris had said the call's origin was being traced. She had said it with the particular quietness of someone who was not going to say more than that in a motel parking lot in Elias County, Montana, at 11 at night. There were more layers. Elena understood that the structure above Eccles was real, and it was larger, and it was not going to unravel in a single day or a single indictment. Some of what Dom had documented would take years to fully investigate. Some of it might never produce a courtroom outcome. lives. The world was not a story where all the correct endings arrived on schedule. But the core of it, the fraud that had killed patients, the supply chain manipulation that had endangered soldiers, the specific human beings who had made those decisions and profited from them, and then sent armed men after a nurse and her child to protect themselves, that core was cracked open, and it was not going to close again. The files were in too many hands. The testimony was in too many records. Even the call from the layer above Eccles was documented now, and documentation had a way of surviving the people who wanted it not to. Had believed that he'd structured everything around that belief. He'd spent the last months of his life building something that would outlast him, and it had life. And the fact that he hadn't lived to see what it produced sat in Elena's chest like a stone she was going to carry for a long time and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She slept for 10 hours that night, which she hadn't done since before Nora was born. The weeks that followed had the texture of institutional process, which is to say they were slow and detailed and frequently frustrating and occasionally clarifying, and never anything like what happens in the space between the crisis and the resolution in stories that are told afterward. There were depositions. There were follow-up interviews. There were 3 separate legal consultations about Elena's own exposure, the theft of confidential records, charge that Voss had engineered, which dissolved progressively as the fabricated nature of the original complaint became documented. Each peeling back to reveal what had always been underneath, a nurse who had found evidence of wrongdoing and tried to report it and been punished for it before she could. A nursing license reinstatement came through on the 9th day after Voss's arrest. It arrived as a formal letter with the state licensing board's seal, brief and bureaucratic in the way of official corrections. And Elena read it at Mason's kitchen table with a cup of actual good coffee. She'd found better beans in Elias and set it down and looked at the wood grain of the table for a moment. Good news, Mason said from across the table, where he was doing something with a topographic map that she had slowly come to understand was his version of thinking. Mason's is back. He looked up about time 14 days after the arrest, she said. That's actually fast for a state board. Still took 2 weeks for them to fix something they should have questioned before they took it in the first place. She looked at him. He said it without heat, which was the most damning way to say it. Yeah, she said it did. Nora had started at the Elias Elementary School on a temporary enrollment that the district had managed with more grace than Elena had expected, which she attributed partly to the school counselor, a young man named Patrick, who had the showy competence of someone who had chosen his work with genuine intention, and partly to the fact that Nora was adaptable in ways that still occasionally broke Elena's heart, because adaptability in children was not always a gift. Sometimes it was just what happened when a child had moved enough times and been uncertain enough days that they learned to find their footing fast, because the alternative was worse. Had taken to visiting the school during lunch breaks, which was not an official arrangement, and had required a conversation between Mason and the principal that had somehow resulted in the dog being formally designated a comfort animal for the remainder of the school year, a designation that no one had known was available for a retired military canine, and that Mason had accepted with the same flat practicality he applied to most things. Nora stopped having nightmares after the 3rd week. Ina noticed it on a Tuesday morning when she realized Nora had slept without waking from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. and had come downstairs in the gray early light and found bracken and made herself a bowl of cereal and was sitting at the table reading one of Mason's old paperbacks. She'd now found a box of them in the spare room and worked through them with the systematic appetite of a child who had not had a stable library in months and just existing in the particular uncomplicated piece of a person who has slept all the way through. Ina stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't entirely known was locked. The formal congressional notification regarding the Solbridge investigation was issued 6 weeks after Elena's transmission. It was not a press conference. It was a classified briefing to the relevant oversight committees. The existence of it was reported by 3 separate journalists within 48 hours, because that is how Washington works. Watchdog journalist who had received Elena's documentation package, a woman named Petra Valance, who had been covering healthcare fraud for 11 years and had the specific terrifying focus of someone who had waited a long time for a case of this magnitude, published a detailed investigative piece. The same day the congressional briefing was acknowledged. The piece did not name Elena directly that had been discussed, and Elena had said she preferred it that way for now, for Nora's sake, and Valance had respected that without making it a negotiation. It named Eccles, it named Solbridge. It's named the specific patient harm outcomes. 7 confirmed deaths attributable to defective supplies with documentation and the military supply chain irregularities and the procurement fraud mechanism. It was thorough in the way that good investigative journalism is thorough, which is to say it was upsetting in a proportionate and specific way that did not reach for more than the facts required. Harlan Voss's arraignment was 3 days after the piece ran. It was not the quiet institutional proceeding that his lawyer had presumably hoped for. There were cameras outside the federal courthouse in Missoula. There were former Redwood Valley employees in the gallery. The charges read into the record took 4 minutes. Voss stood with the particular rigid stillness of a man who has made a career of controlling rooms and is now standing in one he cannot control, and he said nothing except through his attorney, and his attorney's request for bail was denied on the basis of flight risk. Elena watched the arraignment coverage on her phone that evening, sitting on the porch of Mason's cabin in what had become, in the weeks since the blizzard, a natural part of her day, the evening hour after Nora was down. The Montana sky did the things Montana skies do in winter, which were consistently and inexhaustibly extraordinary, and which she was slowly learning to sit with instead of just passing through. She watched Voss walk across the courthouse steps, and she felt not triumph. She'd thought she would feel something sharper than what she actually felt, which was something more like completion. A sentence that had been running for a long time, finally finding its period. She put her phone away. Mason came out with 2 cups and sat in the other chair and handed one over. How was it? He said, smaller than I expected. He considered that. People usually are. She looked at the sky. And he was just a man. A scared man in a good coat. She paused. I spent 9 days in a van running from that. You spent 9 days running from what he was capable of doing, Mason said. From who he was. Those aren't the same thing. She thought about that. It was accurate. Voss himself was ordinary ambitious and frightened and willing to cross lines. That frightened people crossed when they thought no one was watching. The danger had been the machinery around him. The money, the connections, the willingness to direct that machinery at a person. Not him. His choices. Raymond Eccles is cooperating, she said. Phosphorus. Told you. She told me there's been significant progress in identifying additional network elements, which in her language means he's talking. Good, it means the layer above him might actually get touched. She turned the cup in her hands. There are no guarantees. No, he said, there aren't. She looked at him. You're not going to tell me it'll be okay. I know if it'll be okay. He looked at the sky. I know the people who needed to be stopped have been stopped. The rest of it. He paused. Sometimes the rest of it takes longer than feels right. That's not satisfaction, but it's not nothing. She looked back at the sky. Deserved to see this, she said. Yeah, no qualification. Pivot. Just the acknowledgement, clean and direct. He did all of this without knowing if it would work. He built the whole relay, set up all the accounts, planned the encryption, mailed me the drive 8 months before he died. He'd been carrying it alone. She stopped. He never told me. During the 3rd tour, during the debrief afterward, he never said a word about what he'd found. He was protecting you, I know. She closed her eyes briefly. That's what makes it worse. Mason was quiet for a moment. He spoke. It was careful, not consoling. He'd learned that she didn't use consolation, that the more accurate thing was better even when it was harder. He didn't trust the official structure to protect you. So he built something outside it that would. It's not a small thing. No, she said. The 5th file, Dom's letter, the account of what had happened on the 3rd tour, and the officer who had filed the false report was in Ferris's hands and had been since that evening in the Redwood Valley hallway. The investigation into that specific officer, whose name was Brigadier General Paul Kessler, and who had been retired from active service for 3 years and was now affiliated with a private defense consulting firm, was classified at a level that Ferris could confirm existed but could not discuss the details of. Elena had been told to expect a military inquiry contact within 60 days. That contact came at 43, a JAG officer named Major Tess Abrams, thorough and serious and young enough that Elena kept having to recalibrate her expectations. Arrived at Mason's cabin on a Tuesday with 2 colleagues and a set of questions that covered 45 minutes of the 3rd tour's operational record in precise, specific detail. Elena answered every question. She had lived with the accurate version of those events for 4 years, and telling it in full to someone with the authority to act on it was one of the more disorienting experiences of recent weeks, not because it was difficult, but because the relief of it was larger than she'd prepared for. At the end of the session, Major Abrams set down her pen and said, Sergeant First Class Vard's account and yours are consistent in every material detail with the signals intelligence record that was classified at the time and that we've now been granted access to. Elena looked at her. What does that mean, practically? It means the official record of the operation is going to be corrected. It means the cause of death for the service members who were lost will be reviewed. And it means the filing of a false official report by a general officer is now subject to formal inquiry. Abrams paused. It's going to take time, I know, but it will happen. Elena held the J officer's gaze. Major Abrams was not making a guarantee she couldn't keep. She was communicating a professional commitment from someone who had enough of the picture now to understand what it meant and meant what she was saying. Thank you, Abrams said, not letting this disappear. The clinic came together in the spring, in the particular Montana spring that came in fits and reversals, 3 warm days, and then a hard frost, the snow retreating, and then returning, and then finally by mid-April, giving up on the lower elevations for another year. The property was 6 miles from Mason's cabin on a parcel that had been a veterinary outpost before the vet who ran it retired and no replacement came, which was the story of rural healthcare infrastructure everywhere, and the reason Elena had chosen this specific location. The building was sturdy and the plumbing was functional, and the exam rooms required paint and better lighting and new supply cabinets, and about 3 weeks of work that Elena and Mason and 2 volunteers from the county did themselves on weekends, which was imperfect and took longer than planned, and resulted in one significant argument about ceiling fixture placement that was ultimately resolved when Elena bought a ladder and installed the fixtures. Herself at 7 in the morning before Mason arrived. He arrived to find the fixtures installed and Elena on the ground drinking coffee and said, "You couldn't wait." "I had time," she said. He looked at the fixtures. "You used a level, I used my phone." He made a sound that was not quite disapproval. He got coffee from the thermos she'd brought and sat down on the floor across from her and looked at the room. "Looks like a clinic," he said. "That's the idea." Harlan Voss civil settlement, a separate proceeding from the criminal case, brought by the families of the 7 patients whose deaths were linked to the defective supply materials, was announced 2 days before Elena's clinic opened. It was not the number the families had asked for. It was considerably more than the hospital's initial legal position, which had been to deny liability pending the criminal proceedings. The shift had come after Voss's criminal attorney entered a partial guilty plea on 4 of the fraud counts, which had reframed the civil exposure in ways that made fighting it more expensive than settling. The settlement terms included a formal statement of institutional responsibility, which was the part that had taken longest to negotiate, and which 3 of the 7 families had said mattered more than the money. Elena read about the settlement the night before the clinic's opening day, in the same chair on the same porch where she'd watched the arraignment coverage. The sky was doing something extraordinary again, which she now expected. Becken was on the porch at her feet, and Nora was inside at the kitchen table, doing homework with the specific intensity of a child who had decided that school was something to take seriously. A decision she'd apparently made somewhere in the first 2 weeks at the Elias Elementary and had not revisited. Mason was in the barn. He'd been rebuilding something mechanical for the past 3 days, with the focused absorption he brought to physical work, which she'd learned to read as his version of processing, not withdrawal. Just the way he moved through things that needed moving through. He'd had his own hard weeks. The cabin that had been Kira's had been accessed and assessed and returned to him in the aftermath of the federal operation, and whatever that had surfaced had been dealt with quietly and without commentary, and she hadn't asked about it directly because she understood the shape of it and understood that he would talk about it when he was ready and not a moment before. He had talked about it, though, one evening at the kitchen table after Nora was in bed and Bracken was at the door and the wood stove was running low. He'd told her about Kira. Not the illness, not the ending the person. The woman who had found a broken-down hunting cabin and seen what it could be. Who had argued about windows. Who had taught herself to identify 12 different types of Montana wildflower and made him learn them too because she said it was embarrassing to live somewhere and not know what you were looking at. Athens, who had been sick and known she was sick, and made a life around the edges of that knowledge with a thoroughness and a humor that he could still not entirely account for. Ina had listened without filling the pauses, and when he stopped she hadn't said it was okay or that time helped or any of the things people said when they didn't know what else to do. She'd said she sounds like someone who was exactly herself, and he'd looked at her for a moment and said, yeah. She was, and that had been the right thing, which she'd known only because she'd said it without thinking about whether it was right. The clinic opened on a Thursday. 18 people came in the first week. a rancher, with a shoulder injury that had been poorly managed because the nearest adequate facility was 90 Smiths away, and he'd kept putting it off. A woman who needed a wound care referral for a diabetic ulcer that had been undertreated for the same reason. 3 children whose immunization records were incomplete because their parents had no local access to the relevant services. An elderly man who'd had a cardiac event 3 months prior and had been sent home with paperwork and no local follow-up. All of it was dramatic. All of it mattered. Ina worked with the calm, focused attention she'd always brought to clinical care, which had never been about performing competence. It was just the actual thing. The reason she'd gone into medicine in the first place. Before the hospitals and the politics and the 12-hour shifts and the supply manifests that didn't add up. The reason she'd been a combat medic before that, not for the intensity, not for the narrative of it, but because there was something fundamental and irreducible about being the person who showed up when a body needed help and being able to do that thing well. She'd never found another version of that worked the same way. She'd stopped looking for one 2 weeks after the opening. A nurse named Raquel drove out from Elias to ask about working 2 days a week. She was experienced, she was practical, and she had the specific quality of someone who had left a bigger facility for reasons she was not forthcoming about and which Elena recognized without needing the details. She started the following week. Major Abrams called in late April with an update. Kessler was under formal military inquiry. 2 additional officers who had signed off on the falsified report were under review. The corrected operational record had been submitted and was being processed through the relevant command structure. It was grinding. It was happening. Dom's family, Elena said. They've been contacted. Yes. Science. Abrams paused. His mother asked who had brought this forward. I told her it was a colleague who had served with him. Ina looked at the window of the clinic. Outside, the April light was doing what April light did in Montana, tentative and bright in alternation. The kind of light that was working at it. How was she? Elena said she was. She cried. Abrams said. And then she said she'd always known there was more to it. She said Dom was not a person's hap to accidentally. A pause. I think she's right. Elena closed her eyes for a moment. Dom was not a person things happened to accidentally. Had decided things, planned things, built things across time with the careful intention of a man who understood that the world moved on documentation and that if you wanted something to survive, you had to build it to survive. He'd been right. She'd carried his work across 9 days in a Montana winter, and she'd gotten it to the people who needed it, and it had done what he'd built it to do. That was not a small thing. That was what he'd chosen, and it had mattered, and she was going to live the rest of her life aware of the weight of that, and aware that carrying it was not a burden but a form of witness. The Solbridge investigation expanded publicly in May, when the DOJ announced charges against 2 additional individuals with executive positions in companies connected to the holding structure. Neither name meant anything to most people. To the people who had been working the fraud thread for 14 months, they were the first visible handholds on a much larger structure that was still slowly being mapped. Ina followed the news with the attentiveness of someone who understood what the names connected to and why they mattered, and with the patience of someone who had stopped needing the resolution to come all at once. Voss was sentenced in June, 23 years on the consolidated charges, reduced from the maximum after the partial plea, and after the civil settlement was factored into the sentencing guidelines. Ina was notified by Ferris before the sentencing was made public, which was a courtesy she hadn't expected and which she appreciated in the quiet way she appreciated most things without making it larger than it was. 23 years was not justice in any complete sense. It was accountability, which was different and less satisfying and considerably more real. The 7 people who had died were still dead. The families who had received a settlement check and a statement of institutional responsibility were still living with what they'd lost. Accountability could exist alongside grief. It didn't replace it. Ina knew that she had known it before this, from other contexts, from other losses. It was something, it was the weight of the thing applied back to the people who had made the decisions. That mattered. She drove back from Elias after getting Ferris's call, and she turned into the long drive toward Mason's cabin and saw that Nora's school bag was on the porch, which meant she was home, and that Mason's truck was there, which meant he was back from whatever he'd been doing in town that morning, and that Bracken was lying in the stripe of late afternoon sun that fell across the porch boards and was doing the thing he did in warm light, which was to become completely inert and deeply satisfied and take up as much space as a 70-pound animal could reasonably take up. She sat in the truck for a moment. She thought about the morning 9 days 23 weeks ago, now when she'd walked through a blizzard with her daughter's hand in hers and knocked on a door that had no reason to open for her, and it had opened anyway. She thought about how close she'd been in those days to believing that the only way forward was alone. The help she needed didn't exist in the form she needed it. That the document she was carrying would either save her or it wouldn't, and either way it would happen without anyone standing beside her, because she had made herself too careful, too contained, too practiced at being her own entire structure. She'd been wrong about that, not wrong about the carefulness. The carefulness had kept them alive. Wrong about the alone. Wrong about the idea that asking for help was a vulnerability rather than a strategy. Wrong about the door. The door had opened. A man she didn't know had looked at her and her daughter and a dog that had understood something before any of the humans did, and he'd made a decision in the space of a breath that had changed everything that came after. She didn't think of it as luck exactly. She thought of it as a choice that Mason had made without being obligated to make it, without any guarantee of what it would cost him. And the fact that it had cost him something, the cabin, the quiet life, the 4 years of careful distance from a life that had hurt him and he'd paid it without keeping score, was the kind of thing she thought about sometimes at the end of a day and couldn't entirely put into words. She got out of the truck. Nora came around the side of the cabin at a run with Bracken 3 steps behind her, which was the way they moved now, inseparable, effortless. A dog matching the child's energy with the unbothered adaptability of an animal who had decided that this was his work now, and it suited him. Nora said, Mason showed me how the compass works with the stars. You can figure out which direction you're going even if the map is wrong. Elena said. Did you know Dom taught me in the field? She caught Nora and stopped her forward momentum with both hands on her shoulders. It works better when you practice, that's what Mason said. Nora pulled one shoulder free in the particular way of children who accept affection and also have places to be. Can we get chickens? No, Mason said maybe, because it's not his house. She looked up from this exchange and found Mason standing in the cabin doorway with his hands in his jacket pockets and an expression she'd come to recognize as his version of amused, which was very small and very real, and only appeared when something had actually landed. I said. Possibly, he said for the record. You said maybe, Nora said. Those are different, they're the same. He looked at Elena. She looked back at him. The evening was coming in from the east, that deep cold blue that she'd stopped bracing against and started looking forward to, and the mountains were doing the thing they did at this hour where the snow line caught the last of the light and held it. Boss, she said. He looked at her. He understood from her face what she was telling him, without her having to say the number. He said. She nodded. She looked at the mountains for a moment. She felt the day settle, the call from Ferris, the drive back, Nora's voice, Bracken's weight against her leg, the cabin behind Mason where the wood stove was probably already going, because he was meticulous about that in the evening hours, to the ordinary weight of a day at the end of a long road. She didn't have a word for what the last 23 weeks had made her. Been a combat medic, she'd been a trauma nurse. She'd been a whistleblower and a fugitive and a witness, and now she was the person who opened a small clinic 6 miles down the road 3 days a week and trained other nurses in wound care protocols that she'd learned in places with its worse lighting and higher stakes and made do with less. She was all of those things in the same body with the same hands, and the person she was now had been built from every version she'd been before, not in spite of the hard ones, but including them, incorporating them, using what they'd cost her instead of trying to separate the cost from the person it had shaped. That was not an uplifting realization. Exactly, it was just accurate. And accurate was what she'd always been able to work with. I'm going to write to Dom's mother. She said. Mason was quiet for a moment. Will you tell her? What he did in detail. She looked at the mountains. She deserves to know what her son built and why and what it did. Not the official version. The actual one, that'll take a while to write. Yes. She looked at him. I know, he held her gaze in the way he had, direct and without comment, and without rushing anything toward a shape it hadn't found yet. It was one of the things about him that she had come to rely on, without entirely deciding to his willingness to let things be what they were. Nora was at the edge of the porch now, holding the compass level in her palm, watching the needle settle. Bracken sat beside her with his nose lifted slightly toward the evening air, reading whatever dogs read in cold mountain air. Some information that was inaccessible to humans, and that he processed with the same complete authority he brought to everything. Ina looked at her daughter, who had slept through a blizzard pressed against her side, and eaten crackers off a hospital nurse's tray, and started school in a new town and learned compass navigation from a retired Navy SEAL and asked for chickens who had been through the shape of these months without being broken by them, which was not because she was unaffected, but because children were not what adults feared for them. They were whatever the people around them made possible. Elena had tried to make it possible for Nora to be okay. She thought she had mostly not perfectly. She'd made decisions under pressure that she would reconsider forever. There had been days in the van when she'd handed Nora a granola bar and said, "We're almost there," when she didn't know where there was. She had not been a perfect mother in those 9 days. She'd been a person doing the best she had at the edge of the hardest thing, and the best she had been enough, and Nora was here reading a compass in the last light, and that was the measure that mattered. The door she'd knocked on had opened. That was the other measure. It had opened not because she'd deserved it or earned it or presented the right credentials, but because a man had looked at a woman and a child in a blizzard and made a human decision in 3 seconds that changed what came after for both of them. She had spent years believing that strength meant needing nothing. But the people who survived were the ones who carried their weight alone, who built systems around themselves that didn't require anyone else to function. She'd been good at that. She'd gotten very good at that. But the thing that had actually saved her, the actual pivot point, the place where the 9 days stopped spiraling and started resolving, had been a door. It had been Mason opening a door in a storm when he had no obligation to and everything to lose, and Bracken standing in the entryway reading the darkness, and a small girl in an inadequate coat who had not spoken a word, but had held her mother's hand with the specific grip of someone who trusts completely. That was what strength had looked like in the end, not the ability to keep running. The decision to stop and knock. She walked up the porch steps. Bracken moved to make room for her without being asked, because he always made room, and Nora looked up from the compass and showed it to her, the needle pointing steadily north. The face of it, small and accurate and completely reliable. And Elena looked at it and then at her daughter's face and felt something that she had no name for, that was neither joy nor grief, but contained both lives, specific complexity of being alive and intact, at the end of a thing that could have ended differently. Good said, "You've got it, the needle always finds north," Nora said. Even when it's cloudy, even then, Elena put her arm around her daughter. That's the point of it. It doesn't need to see the sky. It just knows, Mason said from the doorway. Dinner's going to burn if nobody pays attention to it. Then pay attention to it, I made it. You can pay attention to it, she looked at him. He was holding the door open with one shoulder, the cabin behind him, warm and lit and smelling like something that was burning at the edges in a way that was probably recoverable, and his expression had that small realness to it that she'd learned for. And he was waiting with the patience of a man who had learned to wait and was no longer doing it from a place of loss. She went inside. The door closed behind them. The needle kept pointing north.